So when I started my practice in Haryana, for example, we had Raghunath Mistry, who would explain to me all the skills that he had mastered in his whatever 30, 40 years of working. And sure, I learned from him, and I was really grateful that I was learning from such a great teacher. Because I also realized as an architect that it's not enough to simply conceive of something, but you have to build it, and to build it you require the hands that are able to build it. And so that was for me um, an essential practice, and something that I needed to learn from people who could build this. And even later, now that I work with larger contractors and established contractors, should we say, I find that since we use a lot of craft in our work, I find I'm guiding them to get to the craftsman. For example, we are doing a project in central India in which the contractor said, "मैंने ले तो लिया, लेकिन ये मैं नहीं बना सकता. ये this worldly art in the panels or the terracotta panels." So actually, I found it was quite easy to get to the right workman and say कि इनसे बनवा लो ना. अब आप इनसे deal करो, and we'll work out whatever it is. I mean, so in a sense, today I'm a little less concerned about what it will cost. But when I began my career, of course, I was extremely concerned about what it will cost, because I started out as a contractor actually, so I was even paying for the craft that I was learning from, and therefore, for every rupee that I would spend more, I would be making 1 rupee less. So that's the story that has gone on. But I think there's another interesting aspect that I want to point out, which is that a lot of this vernacular business is really naturally sustainable. Why is it naturally sustainable? Because it was developed at a time in human history when fossil fuels were not burnt. A. B. Populations were relatively small. So, for example, water was abundant, for example, which it is not the case anymore. And architecture was, to again quote this thing, was influenced strongly by climate, local materials, skills, and cultural factors. But that's what we are trying to do in sustainable practices also, isn't it? So, in a sense, there are two types of sustainable practices that I now see, which I have even started naming them as different. One is the vernacular sustainable practice, which I call sustainable, and one is the certification oriented industrial green practice, which is frankly just green and not really sustainable. And I started trying to identify what that sustainable practice does that green practice does not do. And I find that sustainable practice is a macrocosm, it's a larger version of green practice. So, for example, while green practices would work with mechanical equipment and so on to produce, say, more efficient outcomes, uh, I find that our sustainable practices even question the idea of why we need to consume so much after all. It questions the idea of, do we need so much space? Questions the idea of, do we need to live so far away from our place of work? Questions the idea of, do we need so much water? Do we need so much energy? Do we need to set the temperature to 24 or 22 or whatever we set it to? So those are the kinds of questions that frankly green architecture does not ask, and which is why I find vernacular is a better entry point into good practice today than conventional thinking.
Okay, thanks, Sanjay. Habib, what Sanjay said, he definitely pointed out the two school of thoughts. One is the technocentric school of thought, which he says, which is about green architecture, where it says the technology has answers to everything, and sustainability also technology will have answers. Whereas the ecocentric school of thought that believes that until and unless the fundamental principles of ecology are not respected and adhered to, we cannot achieve sustainability. You, as an academician, Habib, as well as a professional architect, how do you see this particular concept as?
Uh, First of all, thank you, Sanjeev, for considering me worthy enough to be on this panel. And Sanjay and Chaya sir have been my idols since a long, long time. Although I may be looking visually almost their age, but I've been emulating their work and their thought process. It's an honor to be here amongst you, the three of you, and my friend Durganand and Navneet. I absolutely agree with what Sanjay has just said. The concept of sustainability, as it is seen per se by a majority of the fraternity, i- is not in the right direction. It has to be, like you said, egocentric. The fundamentals of our existence and the way we build and the way we think have to be questioned. And if you recall, Sanjeev, we have been discussing this in the degrowth forum quite a lot, wherein we say the necessity of what we are doing has to be questioned. The so-called parameters of our growth have to be questioned. So-called parameters of GDP and the parameters that we judge what is sustainable or so-called green architecture is to be questioned. The I believe it's a big sham on our fraternity, the concept of so-called green architecture or rating systems or all these are my personal opinions, but I think it's a big sham on the entire system. You have to question the industrialized methods of achieving sustainability. And that's a fundamental issue which we all need to really, really think and go back to our roots, go back to the larger blanket of vernacular and arrive at a thought process uh, which gives you a sustainable, so-called sustainable, but which gives you a just and enough means to build and to live. So that's a discussion that we can have further. But you basically question the the likelihood of the newer generation or the students adopting this thought process. And we have been collaborating on this in your studio also. And I had the fortune of seeing the kind of work that your students are doing. And we are also following this similar method in philosophy in our schools in Nagpur, in PH. And uh, somehow, I think the younger generation is a little disillusioned with the kind of architecture or kind of work which is being produced these days in our country. The globalization and the modernization, so called, and the universalization that has happened of architecture is taking the generation away from their own roots. And this somehow we feel when we interact with the students that this is at the back of their mind. So when we talk of vernacular studio, when we talk of documentation of such settlements and techniques and construction techniques, aesthetic principles and art and craft and everything that goes into our traditional architecture, vernacular architecture, they are more interested in learning that because ultimately humanity and mankind wants to have an anchor, and vernacular provides that anchor and provides that root. And I'm very happy to know that the interest, although this is a non-glamorous field, a modern building of so-called parametric or glass cubes or boxes or similar kind of architecture evokes a lot of glamour and a lot of followers, fan followers. But there are substantial lot of students who is actually looking at finding their roots, and that's a very healthy trend that we need to catch on and capitalize on and make them aware of their roots and make them aware of an architecture which is more sensitive, more economically viable, because it not only rejuvenates the local economy but it also uh, preserves and revives the traditional arts and crafts of our rich cultural heritage in our country. So we as academicians need to look into this aspect and cash in on the interest that is now being evoked in the students.
Uh, Thank you, Habib. I remember a very interesting thing when we talked about sustainability. My grandfather had been a farmer, so I used to go every summer vacations. I used to go to my village, and there during summers, the house part of the house was mud with mud walls. So during summer they used to desilt the pond which was beside the village, and they used to use that clay to basically repair the walls and prepare it. So I asked my grandfather why you are doing this. So it says that we dig up the pond also in this way, so the percolation capacity also increases, and that these kind of sustainability practices have been embedded in our culture for so long. And
No, I mean,
these are small things, but they are sustainable practices. No? And if we look at that, vernacular architecture, we talk about it as an architecture without architects. Whereas we also see traditional architecture, which is basically for architecture for exclusives, or say temples and monuments and all. So my another question to Professor Chaya is that whether vernacular architecture and traditional architecture are same, or they have certain kind of a differentiality or something like that. Professor Chaya.
Yeah, when we talk about traditional knowledge or traditional systems, normally our history has been so distorted in writing it, the history of architecture, that we only talk about monumental buildings and we only talk about temples and palaces by and large. Put it another way, we talk about everything that was written in Sanskrit. And then there is a huge gap till English comes in. Between Sanskrit and English, there isn't, we don't know. And it is that what we don't know is the living artisanal tradition. That there are knowledges which are spoken knowledges, they are oral knowledges. For example, every branch of craft, whether it is carpentry, masonry, ironwork, pottery, there is actually something which is taught by mouth to the next person joining that field. My father-in-law was a carpenter, and he had to give an exam before he was allowed to call himself master carpenter. And the exam was quite elaborate, but it was not a written paper. It was something that he had to do. So these knowledge systems of the vernacular have a completely different structure and a completely different model of communication and a completely different relationship between the body, the place, and the mental processes. These three are thought of in a different way in the vernacular from the as compared to the formalized, systematized, textual knowledges that come through in the Vastu traditions or in Mackay and the entire colonial tradition of building. And these two in between, there is an entire tradition which we have not paid attention to. And that vernacular, I think, is somewhat different. If we are going to call traditional knowledge as something which is dead and gone, yes, that is gone. Vernacular should not be put in the same basket. You're muted, sir.
Sanjay, how do you respond to this uh,
Yeah. So,
traditional versus vernacular?
so I also strongly agree with Chaya Saab, except to also say that traditional literally is defined as something that has been going on for a long time.
Yes.
Now, long time itself is subjective. So you can call 30, 40 years a long time, 70 years a long time, 500 years a long time, or 1,000 years or 2,000 years and so on.
Yeah.
So as a practitioner, it doesn't matter actually.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
we just have to get something done, and that's all that really counts. So, so in a sense, it doesn't really animate me, except to say that even the regular concrete and brick building that has been so popularized by PWD over the last 60, 70 years and has practically become mainstream will soon be traditional.
Yes.
Who's to say that it won't be?
It is
But,
also a kind of vernacular.
but it's a kind of vernacular, that's true.
Yes.
But I don't think it will be literally vernacular, because we should think of vernacular as something that is rooted in the local culture and crafts and skills and climate, and not just think of all traditional as having become vernacular because of practice. And that's, I think, the point that we should keep in mind.
Habib, if you look at the Gandhian philosophy of basically need and greed, right? So, do you see vernacular as a true reflection of spatiality that is dependent upon need, and the art and art that is based? Do you see that, and traditionality, you see it as something beyond need?
I think these are complex web of words and their meanings that we are actually trying to dissect. Tradition can be anything. I mean, vernacular is a wider and a larger blanket which covers a lot of things, and it can. When since we are all architects, we consider vernacular architecture per se. But there are so many other aspects which are vernacular, which, as I was just saying, there's so many other aspects of vernacular. And similarly with tradition also. But the definition of tradition, if we look at, like Sanjay just said, it becomes something which is going on for a long time. But these days, the parameter of judging what is tradition has been reduced to 2 generations. You start a tradition, your grandfather started a tradition, and then your son is following it, and that becomes a tradition in your family. So the the parameter and the scale has come down these days to tradition. But I think without getting embedded or entangled in the complexity of the meaning of the words, let us understand that without tradition, vernacular cannot exist, and without vernacular, tradition cannot exist. Both are symbiotic in their existence, and because vernacular cannot be without tradition, and traditions cannot be non-vernacular. So basically, if you see we only see vernacular in terms of their visual appearance, or in terms of their aesthetic appearance, and the superficial things that we see and that is seen to the eye. But like you said, it is spatial. It is something to do with the life of people. It's something to do with the culture of people. It is the entire milieu of things, including climate, geography, geology, political connotations, and maybe also religious community practices and so on. All this put together makes it vernacular, and makes it something which is uh, which is very contextual. And the definition of vernacular is also hierarchical. How when does vernacular end, and where does regionalism take over? These are all meaningful occupations for I won't say academicians or researchers or whatever, but I mean these are things which we should not worry about. What we should worry about is the ethos of what vernacular is. We should be worried about what the essence of tradition is, and that is what we need to imbibe in our students. I remember, I know Sanjeev, I know you since 1970, if I'm not wrong. We were together since first standard, and you used to go to your grandfather's house, and I used to go to my grandfather's house in Hyderabad, and you in Lucknow. And I don't remember at all that even in the peak summers we ever needed a fan or a cooler or air conditioner. And then it makes me think, why do we not survive. And these days in summers, apart from the aspect of global warming, you cannot survive in a fan. Not that the temperatures have drastically increased by 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, but it was the construction of the house, the design of the house, which made it so comfortable that you could survive in those summers of the 70s and the 80s without any artificial means. And this is a point which needs to be looked into by architects of today and the students of today and academicians as well.
Okay, so in a way, we see this tradition, vernacular is traditional and traditional is vernacular. But I see vernacular much more deeper in terms of in terms of that. The ethos of vernacular and the present generation. So how do you think, to what extent and how can we include vernacular into our architectural curriculum? So we need that. I know as at the moment I am conducting vernacular studio, I'm seeing a very good response. But if you look at the history of architecture being taught, it is basically, we are not teaching them our living heritage, which is vernacular, isn't it? So how we could include, to what extent and how we can include vernacular into our architectural curriculum? Professor Chaya, can you please?
Yeah, this is a very important question. First of all, I think it cannot be a kind of module which is added to the curriculum. It is something which is an attitude which develops out of experience. So the study of vernacular architecture, I think, should be in part be done through experiential learning. That means that the students should be able to live in such places for a while. And the measured drawing program, for example, that we used to have, is a very important phase in the annual cycle, where you actually for 10-15 days experience the impact of that architecture on bodily comfort, on social relations, and so on and so forth. So one part is that the curriculum must include not just classroom learning, but direct connection through experience with vernacular architectures around the college. And I think this all over India, there are, huge number of examples. And this has to be done. That is one. The second is that there are, for example, if we look at the teaching of history, the gaps need to be addressed. We teach vernacular only as a form of primitive architecture. Tribals, people who are poor, people who don't have access to, and we teach, then we quickly jump. This may be in less than 5 weeks that we will teach that, and we will quickly jump to temple architecture and to European architecture and so on and so forth. However, if we actually look at the range of experiments that were done and are going on in contexts other than formal architecture, they can be made part of history. That's another one. Our construction courses and our building materials courses, they do not treat all these factors. Similarly, our environmental science courses, they do not talk about the various dimensions of comfort, which are to do with way of life rather than simply some measurable, quantifiable factor. And I think, so all subjects need to revalue the notion of what it is to live in a manner which suits a place. And if you think about how you live there, and then what kind of building you make for that, and then what kind of social relations it leads to, then I think we have got a complete circuit of the vernacular notion. The vernacular notion is make something which suits you, suits the place, suits the materials that you have, and suits your sense of comfort. That I think is something which has to come through throughout the course. And I've pointed out 2 or 3 courses in which changes are required, but also in the critique of design in the design studios, there has to be this question brought up again and again. How do you make this fit this place? Yeah.
Sanjay, Professor Chaya talked about contextuality, the climate, the intangibles, and all. So I have seen your works, and I especially your works, and they basically are very oriented towards the contextuality of the place, isn't it? So how do you think that this particular concept of contextuality can be brought into architectural curriculum from your point of view?
Into the curriculum, well, I wouldn't know, but into practice, I can hazard some guesses.
Yes, yes, sure, sure.
Uh, I mean, as I said, I think the most important vector for my own practice was that I could and did speak with many of my mysteries in Hindi and learned from them. And I would even say that this gives me an insight into what might be done in the curriculum. I mean, I don't know. I can actually, I have something like 6 or 7 master craftsmen on my phone list, and I could probably, if I were to be asked to lead a studio in design in SPA or somewhere in Delhi, I would probably call them as guest teachers for practical demonstrations of arches, vaults, domes, shutterless domes, for example, which itself is a huge technique used in Rohtak by a large number of local masons, and so on. So I think my own interest has been entering the vernacular from the point of view of being able to build. And to that extent, yes, I'm concerned a little less with social relations that Professor Chai is talking about, but definitely that comes through as well, one way or the other, because once you start interacting with such vernacular people, if I can call them that, then you automatically imbibe that spirit in all your work. So I mean that's really the answer I have for the time being.
Right. I think that's very much necessary, because if you are able to bring in master craftsmen or master masons to the studios, I think the whole what I will say, I am not having words for that. The entire जिसको बोलते हैं
Mood.
ना आत्मा,
Ah,
स्टूडियो की आत्मा जागृत हो जाएगी.
ah,
So it is somewhat like that, until and unless I know I have experienced this during my field visits. I was studying. I had gone to Arunachal to study the Vanchu tribes, and their houses in bamboo and timber are, and the way they practice their how the culture is related to the construction process also. That was something very amazing, and in a way, it brings a soul to the entire tangible. So, if we are able to bring such craftsmen and such people into the studio as teachers, for some time, for a few days and something, I think our students will be very much influenced, and then slowly their orientation toward vernacular will come, and it will start. The seed of vernacular will be sown into their heart. So, Habib, you have been a very strong propagator of vernacular among in practice as well as among the students. So, how do you see that? How can we make this particular, as Professor Chaya listed down a few subjects, but how do you see, how can we bring it and popularize it among all the colleges? As council president, I would also like to ask you that.
See, first of all, if I put it in the right perspective, before answering your question, I totally agree with Chaya sir what he said. The way we teach history of architecture is absolutely wrong. We are teaching students for 3 years or 2 years, whatever the curriculum may be, of teaching or learning history of architecture. We are talking about iconic structures which are less than 10% of the built mass of that particular era. And I feel that's a totally incorrect approach to teach history of architecture. I would also go a step further and say that it's some kind of a conspiracy by the mainstream thought process, or those who do not subscribe to this thought process, to alienate. There was a subject called alternative technologies or vernacular architecture as a subject or the elective. There's a big conspiracy, to be honest. The mainstream thought process has to be vernacular, has to be your tradition, has to be your roots. So the teaching of history of architecture has to be totally upside down, wherein you bring in this concept of how the other 90% built in that particular era. And when that happens, it will change things to a greater extent, to a larger extent. Now, coming back to what you asked as a council president, or in the new regulations 2020, we have provisions for introducing vernacular traditional systems and other things as independent subjects, as elective subjects. But so council is a regulatory authority and gives a broad framework, but it is up to the academia, to universities and the institutions to imbibe this into their curriculum. We have given a flexible format, and the new education policy also provides for that lateral assimilation of various aspects. So it's basically the institutes and the thinkers of the thinkers in the academicians, administrators who can bring in this aspect. But what we can do as individual contributors is to demonstrate through good quality work, that this should be the viable alternative, and this has to be the viable alternative. We have to talk about it. I was discussing with Chaya sir in Bombay, if I'm not wrong, when we met first, that we don't talk. We means, people who are in the similar thought process. We need to talk. We need to talk about our work. We need to talk about our, we need to publish. We need to write. We need to come in mainstream media. And that is one of the ways to popularize this. And I'm sure we all would start talking about it. It's not a rebellion, it's not some kind of an activism. It should not be seen as an activism, वो खादी का कुर्ता, crumpled कुर्ता पहन के झोला डाल के आ गया, मतलब not that kind of, but honest and a sincere promotion of this thought process has to be there. And I would also say that Sanjay is raising his finger. Okay, I'll join after. What? Yes, Sanjay, please.
No. Please go ahead, complete your thought, because I wanted to speak out of turn in response to something that you said.
I was just saying, if you need to, see, our generation is gone now. We may have few years or couple of decades left, but the generation which is coming, they have to look at this thought process as a viable thought process, not as an alternative thought process. And that will happen when you demonstrate through your success, through your works, and through your effective speaking at public fora, where it should be accepted as a glamorous and successful, viable option for architecture students.
So, yes, Sanjay, you wanted to respond.
I wanted to, well, not so much a direct response, but when I think we couldn't go too far in glamorizing the vernacular also. So it needs to be seen in the proper context. For example, I still remember that I worked in Lokjumbish for many years, which was 6 years in the tribal areas of Rajasthan. And we found that even though the vernacular met many of the constraints of the local culture and skills and materials and so on, there were certain engineering practices that were dubious. For example, not providing a concrete band in order to cater for earthquakes and so on. So we introduced them gingerly at first because we were working with the local masons, with the local craftsmen. So we were not too confident whether it will be accepted, adopted. But since it was a low cost enough intervention and easy to do, so it was easily adopted also. And I can't say whether this saved lives or not because no serious earthquake has happened in that area since 1990s. But I have another quick example from Pokhara, Nepal, where I worked with a Swiss mason called Heini Müller, who had settled in Pokhara. He had married somebody in Pokhara and he settled there. So he wanted me to design his house. So when we designed it, we looked at all kinds of skills that go into the making of a house. And we found that Pokhara was in a very high earthquake zone. And yet we said that since Heine himself is a mason, we should celebrate masonry. So um, he made a pokri, as it is called, a small pond in his 65-acre farm, which is the Nepal's largest organic farm. He made a pokri there, and he used the most stony part of the site as the place to dig the pond. And he mined all the stone from there and used it in his stone masonry. So the whole house is a stone masonry house with ferrocement roofs. And for ferrocement roofs, he trained local masons. The point I'm making is that we managed to introduce earthquake zones. And by the way, this is 23 kilometers east of Pokhara, which was the epicenter of the earthquake that happened in Nepal a few years ago. And I was rather worried because I lost contact with Heine. His phone was not working. And then he called up after about a week. He wrote to me an SMS saying that I was not in town. I was traveling in South America, but Haim was at home. She slept through, and there was no damage to the house. And despite the fact that I mean, it looks completely like a traditional hut. It is like that, and we consciously made it like that. But it has just the right amount of, should we say, modern engineering that
That
allows.
that is contemporary vernacular.
Yes, I
That's what I
was
say.
coming to that
Contemporary.
question. And next question was like that only.
Okay.
So basically, what Sanjay has said that vernacular, if it has to evolve and it has to be accepted, I think the contemporary materials and contemporary a balance between contemporary and our traditional needs to be achieved. So what Habib has been also propagating for many years, contemporary vernacular. And Chayasa will also be will agree to that, because if we want to bring this particular concept into our studios, we just cannot bring it as purely as vernacular, but we'll have to have concepts of modern material and as well as certain technologies to bring in along with vernacular, and a combination of both, which Habib or I also term it as contemporary vernacular. How do you see that? How can we bring this kinds of a kind of a cohesion? I will say cohesion or fusion into our studios, what we can do in our studio so that we are able to embed the concept, the vernacular concept into our students. But the design thinking process also should include the technology and the material in a well balanced way, where the ethos and the essence of the traditionality is not lost. How can we do that, Professor Chaya, in our studios?
I think it's important not to make ghettos of knowledge. Vernacular in one ghetto, engineering in another ghetto, both fighting with each other, riots from time to time. After earthquake, I've seen riots between the certifiers and the makers.
Hmm.
These are the two names I will use instead of vernacular and engineering, because the engineers are very keen on certifying things through expert knowledge as a dominant power of this state-based system. Whereas the maker is more interested in making and making well, if he's a good maker. So the idea that you can split up knowledge into that which is useful and that which is outdated is something, I think, which is not a biologically valid idea. Biology works on the maintenance of diversity. So all knowledge in some way might find reuse. But all knowledge is always alive to new things coming into the view. So if, for example, we find ways of increasing ductility of walls by introducing reinforcement and concrete, is something new coming into view, which in other times may have been done with wood or in bamboo and so on. But we should not leave out the possibilities. So the first impression that we have to get out is that vernacular is dead and is dogmatic. A vernacular language is never dogmatic. See how many English words we have included in our daily Hindi or Gujarati. Our language is always alive to new forms of expression and new words coming into it. I'm told a few days ago, a yo was accepted in the Oxford English Dictionary as an English expression of surprise. A yo. So if that can happen in language, why can it not happen in architecture? Why can it not happen in construction? Why can it not happen in the way we arrange our furniture? Why can it not happen in the way we make a wall? And in all these, I think the openness to thought and the 10-fingered engagement with reality, where you are grasping reality, so that the student is making things rather than simply imagining things. We used to have marks for imagination in studios, and I think that is something which is detrimental, because it looks at what it will look like rather than how will it be made. And I think this is where a change in the manner in which we appreciate design itself is a major factor that needs to come in.
Sanjay, if we look at what Professor Chaya said, he gave two very, very wonderful terms: how it will look like and how it will be made. So, if you look at where you were talking about master masons, isn't it? So, if master masons are brought into the studio, and uh, how it will look like is basically, then the students are able to understand how will it be made through interaction with them. then how do you see the studios will, how will be the students will engage themselves in the studio? I think from your point of view, I would like to
I
hear
think,
that.
yeah, I think the studio would have to be outside for a start. Ideally, the studio would end up creating some piece of architecture, no matter how banal. And this is not something that is impossible to do, even within the existing curricular guidelines. It has been done recently by Dr. Shweta Manchanda in SPA Delhi, when she actually did a construction, no, design come construction studio, and she managed to do this reasonably well with the artisans from Sundarbans in this case, who were settled in some part of Delhi.
Basically, design and build studio you are talking about.
So, so I'm happy that as a practitioner, I did not know the term contemporary vernacular, and now I know it, that this is what I do.
I think Habib has been mentioning this term for long. And I remember when he came first to SPA Bhopal and he had his lecture. This term, contemporary vernacular, I came to know for the first time when he talked about it. So, Habib, how do you see contemporary vernacular coming into the studio, and what could be the way we could go ahead?
So take two or three things. I mean, why did we say contemporary vernacular? To first of all, what Sanjay just demonstrated in Nepal. That's a perfect example of contemporary vernacular, where you understand the wisdom and the way things are built uh, in vernacular architecture, and then you use your knowledge and you augment that particular process of building. Uh, there are a couple of things wherein. See, I do understand that glamorizing vernacular may damage the cause, but that glamorization has to be done to a certain extent, wherein you evoke the interest of the younger generation, and that's it. I mean, one of the questions or the comments that came in the chat I was reading, it still goes back to abstract forms and Zaha Hadid and things like that. So the idea is in our studios, first of all, we need to, what Chaya sir said, how it is made. We do not lay the importance of the basic module of construction, whether it is brick or stone or anything else. We just start with abstract thought processes and concept kya hai tumhara studio mein, things like that, and without making the student understand how it is going to be built. That has to be brought in, number one. Number two, like we discussed earlier, the way we teach history of architecture has to be totally changed. And number three, which is very vitally important, is to sensitize our teachers and academicians towards this cause. And when that comes in, it's a collective effort in the studios which will bring about this change. But unless we demonstrate, like we've built lakhs of square feet in this visual, so-called visual whatever you want to term that name. But when you are able to demonstrate at a larger scale, that similar processes, building processes and construction techniques can also be successfully applied in a so-called glamorous project, a so-called highly visible, successful commercial project, then it slowly and steadily it will build up the case. And we should encourage as academicians to go and study. I was very happy to, know that this time one of the Louis Kahn trophy in NASA is for contemporary vernacular. So they have studied a couple of my projects. Some students have studied a couple of my projects. I'm sure they would have studied other architects' projects as well. But this kind of awareness is gradually creeping in. I mean, I could never think that Louis Kahn trophy in NASA would, take the theme of contemporary vernacular one day. And similarly, it's a long marathon that we are running. And I'm sure in time to come, we'll be able to invite these in our studios. But there are basic 2 or 3 things. The way we teach history of architecture, the way we tell our students to approach a particular design when we give a design assignment, not a problem, I would say, a design assignment. Using the basic construction techniques and methodologies to be taught to the students first. And then talking about it, sensitizing our teachers about it. And this is how, you can bring it into the studios.
I have seen institutions in Thailand and other, where the entire department is basically teaching the vernacular concept for the entire course they are doing. So they are the entire curriculum focuses on vernacular and traditional architecture, and the students who pass out from those courses, they are basically practicing that contemporary version of that traditionality in their practices. So do you think that can certain courses be can be introduced at a postgraduate level to basically propagate more of such concepts coming into practice? And in undergraduate, at what level we can bring in this particular concept into studios?
I think, see,
Professor Chaya.
I'll
Yeah,
just, I'll just, I'll just intervene for a second. We need to understand. We need to first of all strengthen our foundation, which is the undergraduate course, before we jump to the post-graduation course. Our institutions and colleges have a vision statement or a mission statement, which is restricted to those few lines in a paragraph, which is written and forgotten. Our institutions need to have a thrust area, a thrust and a focus on a particular thought process, and that has to be brought in at the undergrad level before we go to the PG level. Professor Chai, Chai sir, I'm sorry.
No, no, that's right. In fact,
Professor
important.
Chaya.
Yeah. You know, in the last question, I talked about ghettoizing knowledge. So if we make vernacular into a title and then apply it to a course and say, this school stands for vernacular, let's say. This school stands for the continuance of vernacular traditions, let us say. Then I think we are making a mistake. A school has to be a place where many thought processes are confronting each other. And the vernacular should be one of the important and uh, significant viewpoints. Not that it is the only viewpoint. It is only through cross-fertilization that the contemporary vernacular will arise, if I can use this term again. Therefore, I think it is important not to create a breed of young people who will go by the title vernacular architects. They should be architects who are capable of grappling with every kind of problem. They should be able to take up the project of designing laboratories. They should be taking up the project of designing a house in Arunachal Pradesh. They should be capable of taking up. So therefore, what I think is that yes, the attitude that the vernacular operates on, which is an attitude of complete attention, attending to reality that presents itself with the knowledges that you have and evolving new knowledges as you start working into the reality of a situation. This is what a college should be like. And I think this would operate at all levels of learning. It is, in fact, an orientation of mind rather than a subject of study or a particular brand of knowledge. I think it is an orientation. And the vernacular orientation is one which says, here's the world. What shall I do with it? This is what I know. That's what I don't know. How can I work? And is energetically following that notion that one find in order to make. And that I think is something which is throughout there in the vernacular traditions.
I think you mean to say that the thought processes needs to be, they should be oriented towards the all kind of thought processes in their foundation years, and then let them decide what and where they have to apply those thought processes. I think Sanjay, how
No,
do you
no,
respond to?
I don't think Professor Chaya means A versus B. Uh, the whole point is that you can be very respectful of vernacular practices and still be a contemporary architect. This is the point that I think everybody is making.
Hmm.
And you can also be completely not knowledgeable about vernacular practices and still do a
Practice.
certain kind of architecture which is, let's say, practiced in the so-called abstractions that is practiced by people like Zaha and so on. But you are still dependent upon a certain kind of industry, to be able to implement it. You are dependent, in the case of the second case, you are dependent upon somebody to change those parameters into a constructible edifice. Otherwise, it's not architecture at all.
Correct. So, if we look at the vernacular, we have already discussed this vernacular and sustainability. So, I think Sanjay has been very active in this concept. So, how sustainability can be brought into, and through traditional systems. So. There is a strong link, that is no doubt, vernacular or traditional knowledge and sustainability has a strong link. I think your thoughts for the students who are there, of architecture students who are here in this webinar, I think that will be, I think, very helpful for them. So I will start with Sanjay and then come to Professor Chaya and Habib. Sanjay, how do you take on this particular concept of sustainability and vernacular, and how you have basically done it in your practice?
See, the thing that, uh, as I mentioned earlier, sustainability kind of comes automatically in a lot of vernacular thought and construction and architecture, because the conditions of society at a time that we might consider.
I may interfere. I meant that contemporary vernacular and sustainability. I'm talking about that.
Okay. No, so all I'm saying is that if you take vernacular as something outdated and therefore to be shunned, then you don't get anywhere with it, of course. But if you understand vernacular in its deep ethos as something that was done because of a certain socio-cultural context, and then understand that this context has changed, the uses have changed, then you can literally derive something out of that is sustainable. Because after all, a lot of traditional practices and a lot of vernacular practices had been implemented in days before fossil fuel use, and at times when water was abundant and population was low and so on. So those are the reasons why. But you need to understand that you can't literally employ it by copying traditional hut design from an old village into something, and call it a modern building. I mean, so clearly sustainability is at the very heart of vernacular architecture, and it's a different kind of sustainability. It's not the high-tech sustainability that's talked about in green architecture, but it is sustainable because it questions everything that you would like to do or play with society.
Professor Chaya, if you look at vernacular or traditional, so we talked about material and all, but also the intangible, or say the social order and the spatial logic of a place. needs to be understood before going to a design thinking process. And if you look at vernacular traditions and vernacular our societies, such intangibles as the social order and the spatial logic generated through the social order, vernacular also teaches that, isn't it? So if we are thinking about contemporary vernacular or contemporary architecture, these kind of thoughts which come from the cultural influences also mold our design thinking process and how they lead to sustainability. Yeah, I would like to
Yeah,
understand
yeah.
from you.
I think there are some interesting things that if we look at the naming of parts of nowadays, we call a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, a bedroom. Yeah? But earlier, perhaps we used to say veranda, we used to say courtyard, we used to say terrace, we used to say garden, things like that. So we did not name the use of a space. We did not make boxes which contained particular kinds of uses. The use moved according to the time of the day and the season. And accordingly, you could sit in the sun or sit in the shade or sit on a swing and get the breeze on your body. And you could do things by which you achieved comfort without using any external sources of energy. Now, if we look at sustainability as in its vernacular sense, it will start with a very few simple things. First, use as little as possible. Be a miser about using up things. The world is made for so many people. Use those things which you need in the best possible way. Don't waste. Now, that is an attitude, that's an entire philosophy of existence, the philosophy of consumption. And so, the more you consume, the better the citizen you are, is what is being told to us by the billboards and the advertising all the time. That you are a better citizen if you consume more. So, if an architecture teaches me that I need not consume in order to be happy or comfortable, then I think it is in spirit of the vernacular. And this is the spirit that we should really be looking for. The spirit of using spaces in different ways, the spirit of taking the season and time of day and the festive time into account when we are making something, and the sense that I am responsibly relating to the world, not consuming the world. These few things, if we keep in mind, then it is the same as the attitude. And then we might have newer materials. We might have new ways of making windows, for example. We might have new ways of making a veranda. The shape might be different. Whether it is done by Zaha Hadid, what does it matter? As long as it is something which is taking into account that you can be comfortable, you can find it useful. If it is not useful, then even Zaha Hadid's architecture, I think, as a inhabitant, I would reject. If I found something not useful there, or something which was not happy to sit in, some sharp corner into which I felt I was being pushed. So it's an entire attitude.
Habib, how do you respond to this
Uh,
sustainability? You must have done a lot of things in your projects. Can you give me some examples?
See, I mean, first of all, sustainability is very intrinsic to vernacular, and both of them cannot survive without each other. Secondly, we need to demolish this image of when we hear the word vernacular, we have to demolish this image in the minds of people that it is only built of mud or brick or a low rise structure or thatched roof or mangrove tile roofs or clay tile roofs or something like that. That's the image that comes into our mind. That's the conditioned image that comes into our minds when we take the word vernacular. That it cannot have a high-rise structure, or you cannot, there's a height restriction and so on. First of all, we need to demolish that kind of concept that exists in people's mind. Because we need to understand the ethos and the entire wisdom of vernacular architecture, the intrinsic and complex relationship that vernacular has with socio-cultural fabric where you are building. It's a very intrinsic web between the socio-cultural fabric, the economic fabric, and the climate, and so many other aspects. And they are very intrinsically linked with the development of vernacular, whether it is architecture or anything else. So we need to understand that. We need to use our contemporary knowledge bank that we all have, and the expertise that we have, and not reinvent the wheel time and again. And that is what contemporary vernacular is all about. And and that is, I think, because it is sustainable, it is vernacular, and because it is vernacular, it is sustainable. I mean, these are again complex terminology, but no vernacular traditions or architecture would have survived had it not been sustainable. So similarly, even today, if you see, someone was discussing the typical governmental PWD brick and concrete column and beam structures have become vernacular. Of course it is. I mean, if you go to a remote village and you will be able to build in concrete column and beams cheaper than you can build in brick or mud or some similar kind of building materials. The idea is to adopt to change. If we do not adopt to change, and if we do not understand the dynamics of the change that is happening in a society, vernacular will be dead, because it cannot survive. And because it keeps changing and evolving, it remains vernacular, because and it grows gradually. So in my practice, I have made an effort to talk about it. I have made an effort to demonstrate that we can build these kind of structures which look vernacular, probably feel vernacular, in essence, in soul and spirit they are vernacular, but yet they are contemporary or modern. So that's the example I'm trying to passionately set, and I don't know if I'm successful.
Habib, can you elaborate on one of your IT buildings which you had done on this contemporary vernacular philosophy? Can you elaborate on that?
No, it was basically an IT building, and the client came to us, and he ran out of money as usual. It happens most of the time, and we had designed the building with a baffle wall, which was about 5 or 6 feet away from the main wall, the inner wall, and we had designed a lot of services to run inside, because IT service is very heavy. And we had designed a brick facade, brick jali, inspired by Laurie Baker's thought process, and various combinations of brick jalis. I think Chaya sir has seen that as well, and you also have seen, Sanjeev. Client ran out of money, and in between, the client came up with this fabulous idea of enclosing the building with sleek glass and steel, cotton steel or thing like that. And we said, we of course put our foot down, but we installed air conditioner inside or whatever. 250 tons of air conditioners were needed at that time. And the building was being used for about a year and a half, and then the clients earned more money and they wanted to finish the building, and they asked us a proposal. So we made a proposal. We honestly exaggerated the estimate a little, and the glass and the cotton steel was costing about 78 lakhs of rupees, which was beyond client's budget. Then we gave our proposal, which was costing 22 lakhs of rupees in brick. And the costing actually won the cause, and the brick was built, the outer wall was built. We could reduce the air conditioning load by half when the project was complete. And that is a demonstration that a lot of students come and learn from there. This is only the outer facade that we're talking of, but inside also, if you see the essence of the planning and the way spaces have been planned, the way double heights and mezzanines and the courtyards and everything has been taken. So this is a very when you give a jali, when you give a facade which cuts down the glare, we are making glass buildings where you bring in the sun and then you bring in the glare, and then you're working on computers and you want to cut the glare, so you put more expensive blinds, mechanized blinds, and increase the air conditioning. It's a crime that we're committing on our country and our citizens. So by this, we've been able to demonstrate that you are cutting the glare, you're cutting the heat, and you are also reducing the artificial HVAC load on the building, giving a better environments for people to work in. So it's not only the facade, or it's not only the outer appearance of the building, but it's the entire ethos and the entire soul of the building. It has been planned, keeping in mind the traditional principles.
Sanjay, can you tell our listeners of any of your project where you have tried to do that?
Yeah.
I think most of your. Yeah.
So yeah, sure. I mean, we had a multinational office for 1,800 people, IT type in Manesar some 10 years ago, where well, we were competing for the job. So frankly, we had with us as competitors 3 very highly stylish contemporary architects, and we knew their work, and we also knew that the middle management wanted them appointed and not us. So, using a go-between, I managed to get literally an elevator pitch. I managed to get in with the boss man on the ground floor and go up to the 5th floor of a building that they were occupying. And I had only those 25 seconds or so to make my pitch. So I did. And I basically, what did I say? Do you want this building to be the most talked about and the most energy efficient and the most water efficient building? We believe we can do this for you. This is really all the time that I had, and that's the only thing I could say. But I think somewhere it hit home because this guy really asked me many, many questions about our presentation, which came later, which we had done a preliminary design. The whole point was that we chose not to design a glassy building, despite the fact that everybody was designing in those days, 10 years ago, glassy buildings for IT corporations. So, but we chose to design a contemporary building, and we displayed a lot of craft in that. For example, the west and east wall, we chose to make them with small openings but highly distributed over the facade in a random pattern so that they created a Piet Mondrian type painting. And this was interpreted in sandstone because we were working in Haryana, and sandstone is literally the local material of Haryana. So um, I still remember a huge contractor had been given the job, and they were stuck saying that ye sandstone to nahi chalega, was change it to aluco bond or something like that. So I was in trouble because I had to justify why sandstone and why not aluco bond, and this corporation did not want to understand the attitude of providing local jobs as one of the criterion. So, so we did this and that, but most importantly, what worked very well was when we could muster together a set of craftsmen who could implement such a wall. And once that was done, and at cost which was equivalent of a Lego bond, because a Lego bond really is a very cheap material, unfortunately, and competing with it is difficult in today's world, and it is also hassle free, and which is why people use it. After all, builders always build cheap and what is hassle, least hassle. I mean, this is a learning that vernacular architecture has taught me, that you look at builder buildings and you start understanding, okay, this must be cheap because that is, this builder is using it. So concrete and brick and alico bond must be the cheapest, and glass must be very cheap. And it is, when you look at it. Unfortunately, economies work in a way that they conspire to make them cheaper also. But I think I wanted to convey one last thought also, which is that vernacular is not very different from simply an Indian way of building or your local way of building. And unless you really understand your local way of building, you don't get to any contemporary way of building. And this is something that I have noticed, and I have a problem with in all architectural colleges and practices that I see around me, that they are very easy about going in for a globalized corporate style, shall we say, and kind of taking off from a Singapore style building, which exists in a different context, which can't have the kind of plants that you have in Singapore. You can't have the kind of water and humidity that you have in Singapore, and so on. So we have never really we've evolved a set of contemporary modern storytelling practices in filmmaking, but we haven't done that in architecture yet. We are I think this generation needs to treat this as a generational project, and I hope that it will do so. And frankly, the way to enter that project is to understand what the vernacular and then take it from there.
Professor Chaya,
Mm.
have you encountered these kind of situations in your practice? And one more question was that in how you have been able to bring in the intangible part into your designs, like Hunar Shala, which basically is a place where community participation is a lot of there. So can you
Yeah. So the first thing I found is that our climate is such that we do a lot of things outdoors or sitting in shade. And so the design of the outdoor space between buildings, between rooms, is more important almost than the design of the room itself. The room in most cases is a kind of glorified cupboard in our case. We keep things there and we sit outside all the time. So I think one of the lessons that I picked up from our vernacular architectures, even when doing contemporary architecture like my housing in Calcutta, where you, the idea is that the outdoor spaces must be rich and full of supports for life. Because we are a people who do not like to be alone. We like to be social. We like to talk to people. We like to celebrate festivals. We even like to have fights with the rickshaw. So all these things, whether it's a fight or a joking session, both of them are social events. And the fight generates a lot of interest in the people around and automatically creates a kind of space. Now, what is the kind of outdoor space? What is the parking space? What is the space between buildings? What is the garden space? What is the roof terrace space? I think these are the kinds of spaces on which I learned to pay attention, whether it is in the craft park in Bhuj, near Bhuj, where we used techniques of working in materials which are unconventional, which belong to, let's say, uh, learnings from all kinds of places, including earth, construction in earth, in stone, in wood, all of those things. But the important thing was the manner in which your indoor and outdoor spaces started creating something that is relevant to our way of life and to our climate. And I think this is where much of my, most of my projects, I'm interested in how people will use those things, how they will be comfortable. And, but at the same time, there is a secret weapon that one has. And that secret weapon is is the, is the rhythm. You know, just as in music you have taal, in architecture we have dimension. And the attention to dimension and multiples of dimensions and the modules of space that are come about as a result of that is something which has fascinated me. That is my private fascination. My public fascination is how you use. The two have to come together.
Wonderful. I think this whole discussion has taken a wonderful shape, and I am really thankful to Habib, Sanjay, and Professor Chaya for accepting and contributing to this wonderful webinar, which is very close to my heart. Now I will. Uh, we don't. I think we don't have time for questions, but I think I was looking at the questions posed by people here, and I was putting it into my discussion. So I think most of them have been answered. So I will now. I'll just ask Nandan to just summarize this whole thing in a few lines, and then I will go to Navneet to give a vote of thanks.
Just one
Nandan,
line, just one
yes, sir.
line before we. I just want to put to the students a question: is chai or filtered coffee vernacular or contemporary? I'll leave it at that.
Nandan,
I think it's been a very, uh, very absorbing session, and more than the end, I see this as a beginning now, something more. I hope this seminar as a gathering ends maybe, but I think this is really a beginning of something uh, more enriching. And since Professor Chaya brought in the chai and coffee is its vernacular, and he's given me a license to confuse this conversation now. And um, confused in the sense not confused, but I think what came through in the last 1.5 hours was how do we begin to start asking questions? I think that's the root. How do we begin to start asking the questions? And because Professor Chaya has given me the license with this chai and coffee, let's say I throw a counter, and this I do regularly for the last 20 years with my students. They don't pick it up or they pick it up. I go to Trichy, I go to Madurai, wonderful. Then they say traditional, indigenous culture, traditional, all wonderful, all we become nostalgic. And then if we did a deeper study, there's not enough documentation, but I deeply suspect this, that there was a massive globalization of Chinese wood, and we called it Burma teak, here. So I wondered how has Burma teak infested Tamil Nadu, and which we today go back and document as traditional indigenous agrahara. But if we look at the root of that wood which came, maybe it came from Burma, maybe it came from China. We go to Madurai, we see a Chinese technique of seasoning the wood. We go to Kochi, we see a Chinese technique of seasoning the wood. The truss is also a Chinese truss. But at the same time, we know that Buddhism traveled to China and to Japan. Now, is Buddhism in Japan vernacular, or is it a process of what we are calling globalization? Now, so I think if I have to pin it, and now this is my interpretation of what has happened in the 1.5 hours, and this is to maybe add my secret weapon to the dimension weapon that Professor Chaya was talking about. I would assume, now this is my view, and it's not, and it's coming from a provocation of this conversation. And because we are ending it, I thought it may be good to just add it right now so that that whole 1.5 hours gets qualified. It was stated, but not stated as clearly, and which is what I thought. Maybe it shouldn't be stated clearly, but I thought let us raise it. What has happened is my own view, and when I teach history now, it's about 30 years of teaching history. Yes, there is a risk of students getting confused in the way you teach history if you don't teach it in compartments. You have to teach that Renaissance happened, and on 14th April in the evening, Renaissance was over, and then you have neoclassical beginning, and then it was over on October 2nd, and then you have modernism beginning. We compartmentalize it. We've not yet come to the date, but we compartmentalize. And I think the root of this problem in naming, which Sanjay Prakash and Habib, I think, rightly pointed out that how do we name it? And I think that opening is given when we use the word contemporary vernacular, because already that's a paradox in a certain sense. And I think to live in that paradox is necessary at one level. Clarification comes by, as Chaya rightly pointed out, and where I would maybe slightly not completely align with Chaya's view, but I think they coexist. If a school, and this is something the council needs to debate, if a school decided that we are going to make architects ready for the industry, now I'm deliberately bringing out a certain view. I think a school has the right to do it, but the school then needs to state it. I think if a school states it on what their beginning point is and what they are delivering within the professional ambit, they have a right. Versus a more enriched form, a much deeper form that Professor Chaya was alluding to, and this conversation today has alluded to, that a school is like a laboratory where there is a collision, conversation of various viewpoints. And it need not be a singular viewpoint. And I think that was very apt for Professor Chaya to have pointed it out, that because that risk of what even Sanjay Prakash and Habib said, that risk of ghettoization, that risk of suddenly again re-isolating ourselves. And why are we re-isolating ourselves? Because of two issues. The pace of globalization and the pace of life is creating change at such a fast level that I now need a rooting and need to stand. And then in that, jumping to the past becomes the easiest alternative, because it gives me an anchor, it gives me a reference, it gives me an identity. But whether it is the right identity for today's times becomes the question. So I think in all this, if the Chinese, let's assume, I'm now making a preposterous statement, that whole of Madurai and Trichy was built only with Chinese wood. Now let's assume I made it, and it was seasoned by the Chinese. Is that an act of globalization, no different from the software parks which are being built right now? Or is it a vernacular approach? Now, the secret weapon, which dimension is the root, but another secret weapon I see as the difference between then and now is that we were open to receiving everything. We were not blocked. We were open. Where it has differed from then and now, which we are calling vernacular, is the process of diligent digestion. How do we take that food, but then how do we digest it to our needs? And I think that digestion comes by an act of awareness with the material, act of awareness with how I want to sit, act of awareness of how I want to gather, act of awareness of what my city is about. I think that process of digestion we have jumped by transposing both urban principles, transposing materials from one culture to another without discussing the digestion. And when we don't discuss the digestion, we know it leads to indigestion or constipation. And then we say that we are at the crossroads.
Yeah.
I think if we reopen, and I thank Habib and Sanjeev for bringing this up at this point, that the vernacular becomes a wonderful reference point for opening this question.
Yeah.
And that is what I see. I'll end with this because there's much more, and there's another seminar following this. But I was provoked by this 1.5 hours because I think all this got very aptly covered in this 1.5 hours, whatever I'm bringing up. But I thought I will provoke it with a certain different set of words. I've just changed the words.
That will lead to the next of the series. Thank you very much, Nandan. Thank you very much, all our panelists. I will over to Navneet, to you for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of COA-TRC Bhopal, I take this opportunity to present our gratitude to everyone behind this webinar series. First of all, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the Council of Architecture, New Delhi, for this wonderful initiative of setting up its training and research center at Manit Bhopal and taking responsibility to conduct such wonderful events across the country, exclusive for students as well as architects. I would also like to thank to our experts, Professor Neelkant Chhaya, Architect Sanjay Prakash, and Architect Habib Khan, for accepting our invitation and putting light on vernacular architecture in an extremely enriching and exciting way. My sincere thanks goes to the President of COE New Delhi for showing the right way to get all the administrative approvals. I would also like to thank Professor Sanjeev Singh and Professor Durganand, who always stood for the COE TRC Bhopal, and their endless efforts made this event possible. Once again, thank you, sir. In the last but not least, I would like to thank all my students, academicians, practicing architects, and experts who are the part of the event. I wish that this webinar series will go a long way for enriching and uplifting the architectural tradition in our country. Once again, thanks to all and stay safe. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Chhaya. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay ji. Thank you, Habib. Thank you very much. Okay, bye, Durga.
Thank you, sir.